The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the neutral cards in Heart of the Elders, the third Mythos pack in the Forgotten Age cycle. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The first neutral card in the pack is Trenchcoat. It's a 3-cost asset with an agility skill icon and the item and clothing traits. While Trenchcoat is in play, you get +1 agility on evasion attempts. It has 2 health and it takes up a body slot. Now, cards that require the body slot are fairly rare in the Arkham Horror LCG. Guardians have Armor of Ardennes from Dim Carcosa and Bandolier from the Essex County Express, while Survivors have the leather coat from the core set. There are 3 neutral cards: Backpack from the Forgotten Age, Bulletproof Vest from the core set, and Fine Clothes from Where Doom Awaits. Now, I've been playing a lot of Fine Clothes in quite a few decks lately. It's cheap, it comes with a health and a sanity, and it improves your odds during parlay actions, which pop up in most campaigns. I have played Bulletproof Vest in squishier investigators if I've suffered some physical trauma. I did test Backpack in a few decks, but I found it quite underwhelming. Trenchcoat is the most expensive neutral asset for the body slot, which doesn't bode well. While it's in play, you get +1 agility on evasion attempts and 2 health. 2 extra health is always welcome, but I don't like the idea of paying 3 resources for it. As for the +1 agility on evasion attempts, it's good if you're trying to evade enemies, but it's not going to save you if you need to make an agility skill test on a treachery, such as on Wings of Darkness, or an act card, such as Wings of Steam. So who wants to play Trenchcoat? Unfortunately, no investigator immediately springs to mind. Guardians as a whole aren't the most agile bunch, and 2 of them are wearing trenchcoats in their art. I don't see Trenchcoat making the cut in a Roland Banks deck. Mark Harrigan seems he likes items with health on them, and he would have an agility of 4 during evasion attempts while wearing a trenchcoat, so he might be a possibility. It's always nice to have the option to evade an enemy rather than fight it if the situation demands it. That said, 3 resources is a lot to pay for an item that really doesn't support your main strategy. That is, of course, killing enemies. Seekers aren't the most agile bunch of investigators either, and resources aren't necessarily a problem for them if they're running Dr. Mylan Christopher. Rex Murphy and Ursula Downs might be interested in Trenchcoat. Rex would have an agility of 4 during evasion attempts, while Ursula would have a 5. Unfortunately, Trenchcoat doesn't solve the biggest problem Seekers face, which is evading multiple enemies. Ursula's usually okay if she's going one-on-one against an enemy, but once that second or even third enemy appears, she simply doesn't have the necessary tools to escape. And unfortunately, Trenchcoat doesn't change that. Trenchcoats are synonymous with rogues, and the card is a much better fit in that class. Rogues likely have the resources to pay for Trenchcoat's exorbitant cost, and most are making evasion attempts for 4 or 5 agility while wearing a Trenchcoat. That said, most rogues tend to have a decent amount of health, and Trenchcoat is probably the first card that they're going to cut to make room for something better. I don't see myself playing Trenchcoat in my Mystic decks either. Mystics can evade enemies using Blinding Light or Mists of Rillier, both of which use willpower rather than agility. Trenchcoat certainly doesn't help you with either of those skill tests. As for Survivors, 3 resources is a lot to spend on 2 health when you can get 2 health for free with the leather coat. If you're playing a Survivor and you're desperate for an evasion bonus, you're probably better off paying the 3 resources for Peter Sylvester. Peter gives you a blanket +1 agility, and he comes with a health, which is not too bad. Trenchcoat is very thematic, I'll give it that. Unfortunately, that's about all this card has going for it. 3 resources is a hell of a lot to pay for a card that gives you 2 health and +1 only during evasion attempts. Trenchcoat, I think, is one of those luxury items that looks a lot better on the rack than it does in your deck. I am going to stick to my fine clothes. Thank you very much. The second neutral card in the pack is Ornate Bow. It's a 4-cost asset that costs 3 experience points. It has combat and agility skill icons and the item, relic, weapon, and ranged traits. It has 1 ammo, and there is a limit of 1 ammo on Ornate Bow. You may take an action and spend 1 ammo, fight. This attack uses agility instead of combat. You get +2 agility and deal +2 damage for this attack. You may also take an action to knock another arrow and place 1 ammo on Ornate Bow. Ornate Bow will take up both hand slots. The first asset with the ranged trait, which likely means that you'll be using agility to fight rather than combat. Ornate Bow is a very thematic addition to the card pool. That said, the card does have several pros and cons. Let's take a look at the pros first. Ornate Bow is neutral, which means that with the sole exception of Carolyn Fern, every investigator can purchase this card to bolster their offense. The bow is a natural fit in any high agility investigator. Skids, Finn, Safina, Silas, Ursula, and Wendy all attack for 6 agility and at least 3 damage with the bow, while several other investigators are attacking for 5 agility, which is pretty good. Lola Hayes in particular has been looking for a good neutral weapon since she was released in the Path to Carcosa, and Ornate Bow does give her an offensive option she can leverage regardless of which role she happens to be in at the time. The Ornate Bow also has the Relic trait, which means you can fish it out of your deck with Dr. Ellie Horowitz, the Seeker ally from the Forgotten Age. If you can stack the bow on Horowitz, it won't take up both your hand slots either, which is a definite plus. On the downside, paying 4 resources for a weapon with 1 ammo isn't a great deal. That said, there are many Guardians who will happily pay 5 resources for a shotgun, which comes with just 2 ammo, so what do I know. 1 ammo is fine for sniping an enemy here or there. It's not great if you get cornered by multiple enemies, especially if you need to take an action and an attack of opportunity in order to knock another arrow. Fortunately, if you're using the bow, you should have a high agility, so evasion is certainly an option in those circumstances where you get cornered by multiple enemies. Ornate Bow may enter play with only 1 ammo. However, unlike other weapons, you may take an action to reload it. It's certainly a nice option to have, but you're really going to decimate your tempo if you're spending a lot of actions to knock arrows turn after turn. If you're interested in playing the bow, you'll have to find a way to play around that restriction, whether that means playing Skids O'Toole, who can spend 2 resources for an additional action, or playing a card like Venturer, a Guardian asset who can place an ammo on the bow as a free triggered ability. Venturer is probably your best bet to knock another arrow quickly, but he is restricted to Guardians and off-class Guardians such as Skids, William York, and Lola Hayes. Finally, the Ornate Bow takes up both your hand slots, which can be quite annoying. You can play around this limitation though. As I mentioned earlier, you can stack the bow on Dr. Ellie Horowitz. You can also play Bandolier, the Guardian asset from the Essex County Express that gives you an additional hand slot. I think the Ornate Bow is a really cool weapon that fits in well with the themes of the Forgotten Age. Sadly, I think it's way too inefficient to make the cut in my solo decks. Spending 3 experience points and 4 resources for what amounts to a one-shot weapon isn't something I'm all that interested in. Tempo is really important when you're playing solo, and Ornate Bow will slow you down a lot, especially if it's your only way to deal with enemies. Ornate Bow is, I think it's a lot more appealing in multiplayer. However, I don't think it's the type of card that you can simply drop in your deck and hope for the best. You really need to be playing it in a specific investigator with specific cards, such as the Venturer from the Forgotten Age, to really support it, and so you're not wasting too many actions knocking arrows. That's going to do it for my review of the neutral cards in Heart of the Elders. The Rogue class received only one card in this pack, but I think you could make the argument that they actually received 3, since Trenchcoat and Ornate Bow work better with Rogues and off-class Rogues than other Investigators. I really don't see myself putting Trenchcoat in one of my solo decks anytime soon. If it gave your Investigator a blanket +1 agility rather than just +1 agility on evasion attempts, I'd be much more interested in this card, but as it stands, I think it's simply too expensive for what it does, and it's really going to have a hard time cracking people's deck lists. I don't think the Ornate Bow is going to see much play in my solo decks either, at least the ones where I'm really trying to be competitive. While I really like it from a thematic perspective of the Forgotten Age, I'm not all that interested in paying 3 experience points and 4 resources for a one-shot weapon that's really going to damage my tempo if I want to reload it. That's a shame, because I am a big fan of Lola Hayes, and Lola's really been pining for a good neutral weapon since she was released in the Path to Carcosa. I think it's a lot easier to overlook the Ornate Bow's inefficiencies if you're in a multiplayer setting. If you're playing Schizo Tool or an Investigator who can take some of the cards that support it, such as Dr. Ellie Horowitz or Venturer, Ornate Bow, I think, could be a lot of fun for picking off an enemy here or there. And I certainly wouldn't it wouldn't be too hard on anybody if they did decide to play it in multiplayer. I think it would be a lot of fun. Overall, I think this pack it's okay. Survivors, I think, are the clear winner, but Rogues and Mystics do receive some useful cards as well. It's nice to see a few neutral cards for change, although neutral cards rarely seem to rise to the top of the heap. I'm not sure whether that's just a design issue. They can't make neutral cards too good. Otherwise, every Investigator would play them. The Forgotten Age cycle is rapidly drawing to a close, which likely means we're going to see a lot of powerful upgrades in the final 3 packs. There should also be an announcement shortly about the next cycle, so I am very excited about that. Are we going to go to Innsmouth maybe and see Silas Marsh, or maybe we're off to the Dreamlands? Who knows? We do have, there is that one encounter set in the core set. I believe it's the one with the Dark Young. We haven't seen a scenario that uses those yet, so maybe we're going to deal with Shub Niggurath or something like that. Between the next cycle and Return to the Dunwich Legacy, which was recently announced, there is a lot of exciting content on the horizon, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.